Is Laura Goldman. I am the dietitian with Premier Weight Loss, and it's my pleasure to discuss this week's nutrition topic with you tonight. And it's all about hidden sugars. And what we mean by hidden sugars is essentially those sugars where they might show up in places you don't suspect quite as often. And hopefully, we can find out what to watch for and ways to address that. And for our weekly mantra, saying that it's the quality of your calories that matters really counts in this situation for this week, because hopefully we will be able to find those higher quality calories with fewer added sugars to help you meet your nutrition goals. So this week, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about why hidden sugars matter, where they tend to be hiding, a little brief overview of reading food labels if you haven't seen that topic that I've covered in the past, a few practical tips to make some healthier swaps. I have one challenge for the week, and as always, I leave time for your questions at the end. First and foremost, let's talk about hidden sugars or added sugars, because I think it's very important that we understand the exact meaning of that. And truly, a hidden sugar, as I again mentioned in the beginning here, is really a sugar that is an added sugar to a food that you may not expect, and also in forms that you might not expect, which I will be touching on a little bit later. So to figure out what an added sugar is, that means it's a sugar or syrup that is added to a food. So this is usually the result of some form of food processing, and that this is something that wouldn't occur naturally in that food. So in the case of adding honey, say, to a cereal, that does count. Honey by itself is not an added sugar. It is a sugar, but it doesn't become an added sugar until you're putting it with a food that it wouldn't normally occur in. Honey bunches of oats, something like that is a very easy way to sort of keep that in mind. And again, sugar is sugar, so it is still important to be thinking about honey regardless of how you're using it. Doesn't mean you can't, but we have to be mindful of that usage. Also, the average American consumes about 17 teaspoons of added sugars a day. And the American Heart Association has a very good graphic, and I posted it here as well. They're fairly strict, but I stand behind the recommendations that they have when it comes to added sugars. And so we can see for men, 9 teaspoons would be the limit, but on average, people are consuming about 17 teaspoons. Women, it's a little less than that. We're at 6 teaspoons, which is recommended no more than that per day. There is no recommended amount to achieve because added sugars are not a required nutrient. Also, just so you can fully understand this image, it's translating the teaspoons into what that means in terms of grams and as well as calories. And we're talking about hidden sugars because it does matter for everyone's health, but let's also talk about why we're paying a particular attention to it with the GLP-1s. We all know that GLP-1s are known to blunt your appetite, and they're supposed to help with blood sugar control. However, they don't stop spikes from happening if we are eating high sugar foods. Just like if you were not using these and you had no issues with diabetes or anything like that, you had no issues with insulin sensitivity, if you were eating a high sugar food, you would still have a blood sugar spike that then the insulin your body creates would help to bring back down. So when we're seeing intake of excess added sugars, that's when we can see those insulin spikes after the sugar spikes, which then will lead to that crash later, where some people might feel sluggish, tired, or develop some cravings for more sweets to sort of start that cycle over again. Also, getting in excess added sugars means that we're having extra calories, and extra calories that we're not intending on can stall that weight loss progress that we're looking for. And as I mentioned, added sugar is not required in our diet and can contribute to health issues such as metabolic disorders, overall inflammation, some weight gain or the stalling of weight loss, and heart disease. And I'm not here to say that we can't enjoy sugar, but it is very important to be mindful. And on the left here, I actually have different drinks that can typically contain added sugars unless you're doing a sugar-free option. And I have these here because beverages tend to, or sugar sweetened beverages tend to be one of the biggest contributors to added sugars in someone's diet. It is much easier to drink these types of sweet drinks quickly than it is necessarily to eat that same amount of added sugar in something like ice cream or yogurts or something like that. So now that we've talked about added sugars, what they are, and how they can affect us, what do we mean about that hidden part? Where are they hiding? And so beyond those obvious foods, such as sweets or desserts, we all know that sugar is in there. We can't fool ourselves there. But they can also be found in foods that are thought to be healthy. And so I do have this chart to the right here where we have a food category. Most of these are some types of foods that you may likely consider as healthy or maybe not contributing to sugars, such as salad dressings or condiments and sauces. But when we're looking at things like yogurts or granola and granola bars, smoothies, or sometimes bread and wraps, these are areas that we might not consider added sugars to appear, but they really can, especially in some of these foods that might be touted as fat-free. Since fat can contribute flavor and enjoyment to what we're eating, if we make something fat-free that wasn't previously, then a lot of times the attempt to make it taste better is by adding sugar. So I like to say that fat-free can often be translated to the words added sugar, and it's very important to pay attention to that. And I wanted to make sure to give you time to look at this entire list in case you would find that interesting. And I do talk about why some of these might be surprising. I know yogurt surprises a lot of people, as well as granola bars and protein bars. But I will mention, and I noted it here, sometimes added sugars in a protein bar is needed for endurance athletes, or maybe needed is since I'm saying it's a not necessary item, but it's very helpful to have when we're having endurance athletes who need a quick jolt of energy to use. Imagine someone who's running a marathon or a hypermarathon. This can be very helpful. So make sure that whichever protein bar you're picking is aligning with your goals. If you are working toward a marathon, this might be a type of bar that you do want to include in your rotation. I also wanted to talk about how you can identify them on a label. I will show the nutrition facts label here in a bit, but I wanted to also touch on the ingredients section of a nutrition label because it's very important that we are able to identify these sugars and see where they are in the ingredients. So first of all, there are many, many names for sugar because they can come in very different or various forms. The most obvious one to start out with is anything that ends with ose in the name, such as glucose, sucrose, fructose, dextrose, maltose, even lactose. It is a sugar, not necessarily added, of course. That's why you wouldn't see it in the ingredients on, say, a milk container. But these are chemically considered sugars. Some of them are much sweeter than others. I do want to mention though, because you may read some ingredient labels where they talk about minimal sugars, et cetera, there is a food or a sugar called allulose out there being used in some low sugar foods. So chemically, technically, we would call it a sugar, but it adds that sweetness without the caloric impact or the blood sugar impact that these others would. So there is an exception to that rule. Also, you may see it in syrups, those count as well. So corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup, which many of us are familiar with, rice syrup, malt syrup, these also count. And I do list here again the natural sugars such as honey or maple syrup and anything like molasses, cane juice, etc. These all translate to sugar and would count as added sugars. And I show here in this ingredients list, it's a type of cookie here. And the very first ingredient is corn syrup. And while I mentioned it a bit later, in the ingredients list, the ingredients are listed in order of weight. And so we can deduce from this that the sugar is one of the main players in this product. Makes sense being a cookie, but I wanted to still point that out. Moving on to that nutrition facts label that was to the left of the ingredients list in the previous slide there. It is important also to look at the nutrition facts to see what the quantity of added sugars are. So first and foremost, you want to check the serving size, because if you're eating more than one serving, then you may need to multiply that amount underneath. So each number here underneath the first section of the nutrition facts label, these are all per serving. So if you're eating more than one, you have to multiply it by that. Then you want to look under total carbohydrates, because sugars are a carbohydrate, and you'll see total sugars and beneath that added sugars. And that's the one main area that we're looking at. Something that can be helpful is the percent daily value, because that can guide you as to whether something is considered a low in added sugar or high in added sugar, more or less. So if it's 20% or more, we can determine that that is considered high. 5% or less, then that would be low. And as we already talked about in the previous slide, the ingredients list will be listed in order of weight. And one interesting little trick is that sometimes manufacturers will use multiple sugar types, such as you will see corn syrup, honey, cane sugar listed, because if you can divide it up like that, then sugar will not be quite as high up on the list. So now we've talked about where you can find the added sugars and how to identify them on labels. It might be a good idea to figure out how to swap out maybe what you've been eating normally to something healthier. I do have a small table here on the left side of the screen where it talks about instead of, and I list on what to try instead. And I try to stay as close as possible to what the original product was, because we're not looking to necessarily just suffer for this. We want to still enjoy certain foods. And if we really are interested in having some yogurt, we need to find a way around that. And while under the granola bar here, it talks about string cheese and a handful of almonds, which couldn't look further from a granola bar, I do list here on some additional tips that kind bars are very low in added sugars, and so that is also a very acceptable substitute, which is a bit closer to being on the nose than this other alternative. I also talk about what to do if you're getting a smoothie from someplace. Try to avoid that fruit juice, and also ask for protein powder to be added. I talk about salad dressings because non-sweet varieties, in my opinion, are perfectly fine. They can still be calorically dense, but we're not worried about added sugars in dressings such as ranch or Caesar. And if you are searching for sugar-free items, then I do advise to look out for sugar alcohols. Sometimes in the nutrition facts label, they will list sugar alcohols. Other times you have to go searching in the ingredients list, and just know that they end in the all sound, so sorbitol, maltitol, xylitol. And why I'm saying to be cautious is because if you eat those in high amounts, then you can experience some gastric discomfort, potentially some gassiness or diarrhea. And I think it's worth warning everyone in advance about that. And also remember that whole foods don't come with an ingredient list. And so, what I mean by this is if you're eating a whole apple or having something that's not been processed and put in some form of a container, box, bag, then you don't have to worry about there being added sugars in that food. And we're already rounding out here at the end. So I wanted to just pick one challenge for the week this week, and that's to ask you to be a label detective. Try and look for 3 packaged foods you eat fairly often, and look for the added sugars on the label. I'd be curious to know if you find any surprises, because there are some foods that are a bit shocking, I would say. Usually, breakfast cereals can be surprising, or granola bars or yogurts. So check that out and see if there's anything that surprises you. And if those foods are high in added sugars, see if you can find a healthy swap based on some of the items we talked about earlier. And if they're low in added sugars or don't have any, give yourself a pat on the back because you've already gotten yourself set up for success there. So now you probably know that added sugars can be everywhere, even in those healthy or health halo foods. But even though the blood sugar control and weight loss can be impeded by having those added sugars, hopefully now you've got a tool to identify them. And not that you have to avoid them completely, but at least you can slowly bring down the quantity. And even that type of small change can really lead to much bigger results in the end. And with that, I leave it open to questions. All right. Well, I hope you found this informative, interesting, and hopefully helpful for the next time you are in the grocery store. Please reach out to myself or to the Premier Weight Loss staff if you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these topics further. That's what we're here for. We're happy to help. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.